Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Packers Unscripted from Packers.com. I am Mike Spofford, joined by the one and only Weston Hodkowitz. We're coming to you here from our studios at Lambeau Field to preview Sunday Night Football, Wes. It'll be the Packers and the Vikings in prime time at US Bank Stadium in Minneapolis. Obviously, the second meeting between the Packers and Vikings this year. And when you look at this Minnesota Vikings season, It's really strange how it breaks down, because I know they've changed quarterbacks multiple times and they may be making another change at that spot this week, which we can talk about. But the Vikings started the season 0-3.
Correct.
Then they won 6 out of 7 games, with the only loss in that stretch coming to the Kansas City Chiefs. But now since then, they have lost 4 out of 5 games, with the only win in this most recent stretch coming by a score of 3-0 against the Las Vegas Raiders, one of the oddest games of the 2023 season across the board. So they've lost 4 out of 5, including 2 in a row. Their playoff hopes are just as much on the line as the Packers are, and this is a team that's still trying to figure out exactly what they want to do at quarterback to try to get themselves into the postseason.
There's a lot going on there right now in Minnesota. And first and foremost, the big part of this, and I wrote about it, and you talked a lot about how this matchup's going to be different from the first time, but just the way that this season has turned for Minnesota after that game at Lambeau Field.
Yeah.
There was a lot of people, I remember covering that game afterwards. It was almost like that both teams had lost when you went into the locker rooms afterwards, because Minnesota thought whatever hopes they had of maybe building upon what they did the previous year in a 13-win season under Kevin O'Connell could probably be thrown down the toilet with losing Kirk Cousins for the remainder of the season. Josh Dobbs sprinkled a little bit of magic fairy dust on them for a minute.
He did.
Then he came back down to earth. Nick Mullins, who was the one that was originally kind of signed to be the backup to Kirk Cousins, well then he has a 4-interception game against Detroit. Jaron Hall, the 5th-round pick that originally was going to be the backup and the replacement for Cousins when Mullins was still on IR, he got a concussion, only plays 10 snaps. So it's just been this whirling dervish right now in that state, trying to figure out what their focal point of their offense is going to be. But it's funny, it's not just that though, right? I mean, they've had questions in the backfield in terms of who their lead back is. TJ Hawkinson tears his ACL. Justin Jefferson misses the middle part of the season with the hamstring injury. There's just been all these different things that have kind of crept up on Minnesota, and ultimately here they are. And in a lot of ways, I think it's poetic. Week 17, just like last year in Week 17, the Green Bay Packers trying to keep their playoff hopes alive, except this time, Minnesota's sitting in the exact same seat.
Yeah, exactly. Last year at this time, the Packers were, as you say, fighting to stay in the playoff chase, and Minnesota was, had already clinched the NFC North title at that point, and they were looking ahead to what they were going to do in the postseason. Yeah, a lot of changes. The loss of TJ Hawkinson is a big one for this Minnesota offense, because with Justin Jefferson missing 9 games with a very troublesome hamstring injury, Hawkinson had been the leading pass catcher, both receptions and yards, for this Minnesota offense. He now goes down. Jefferson has been back in the lineup for the last 3 weeks, with his production steadily climbing to where in the loss to the Lions last week, he had 6 catches for, I believe it was 141 yards, big game, had a touchdown.
Yep.
There. So that's a big weapon for Minnesota to get back, and it seems like Justin Jefferson is sort of back to his old self. And then you have Jordan Addison, who is on the injury report. They're saying he's day-to-day with an ankle injury. He had a big game against the Packers back in Week 8 in late October at Lambeau. And then KJ Osborne, who's sort of been this steady guy who produces when they need him to. He's always there, and he had one of his better games against the Packers back when Jefferson was not playing a couple of months ago. So obviously on the defensive side for the Packers, the matchup here is going to be interesting, just how the Packers play this out, because Jair Alexander has been suspended by the team for 1 game, so he will not be matched up with Justin Jefferson as he has the last couple of times these two teams have met up. And Darnell Savage might be coming back at safety. He's back at practice now after missing some time. And you've got, Carrington Valentine, Corey Ballantine. Keyshawn Nixon is there as the nickel. Not quite sure how the Packers are going to match up against this Minnesota offense, but we may not know until later today or Friday exactly who's going to be quarterbacking for Minnesota with all of this going on.
Yeah, and it's one of those things too where publicly that is what the Vikings are saying. Privately, obviously, you're building a plan around somebody.
Yeah.
To me, again, if I was a betting man, and as you said on yesterday's show, there is no gambling in Bushwood, sir. But I would think Hall gets the call because he is the one guy that is under contract for next year for Minnesota. They did invest a draft pick into him, and he was the guy they were going to turn to in the first place when Cousins went down.
Right, and they did. He started the game at Atlanta, but then, as you said, he got a concussion early on in that game. That turned things over to Josh Dobbs, who had literally been signed just days before that and hardly knew any of the playbook. And suddenly there was this magic going on with Josh Dobbs that helped the Vikings get to 7 wins, which is where they are right now.
But this is where it gets tricky for them because you look at that game against Detroit, and you had Nick Mullins throw for over 400 yards. They had no running game whatsoever. I think Chandler might have been their leading rusher with like 21 yards or 17 yards, something like that.
Yeah, he only carried the ball like 8 times. And they turned over, sorry to interrupt, but they had turned over their running game to Chandler from Alexander Madison. And Chandler had like 130 some yards in the overtime loss to the Bengals the previous week. But suddenly the running game disappears and it's all on Mullins. He throws for 400 plus yards, but throws 4 picks. And Kevin O'Connell's thinking about changing quarterbacks again.
Yeah, and the way that Minnesota built this thing out this year, I mean, it wasn't necessarily surprised that that's the way they were trying to construct the offense because, Josh Oliver gets signed. He's considered one of the top blocking tight ends in the National Football League. You want to be able to establish yourself in that way to complement what you're getting from Justin Jefferson and obviously the huge investment with Addison. You want to be able to play it both ways. And you see why it's necessary in a game against Detroit where the Vikings lose that game by 6 points, but they throw for that many yards, all because of the turnover differential in the margin. So that's why Green Bay, it's going to be very interesting to see how they match up with them defensively. Losing Jair Alexander, there's no circumstance that you can explain to me a scenario in which the Packers are better on the field with Jair Alexander not there. But things happen behind the scenes. Obviously, there was a lot of consternation about how the beginning of the game started in Carolina. And this is where we are with a 1-game suspension here for Ja. So that means Carrington Valentine likely will be thrown back in there. Eric Stokes, more is going to be expected from him with 2 games now underneath his belt because the Vikings are going to hit you. They're not the deepest receiving core in the National Football League. I think there's only 5 guys on their active roster at that position. But Jefferson, Addison, and Osborne is the one I have my eye on because I think he does not get as much respect as he deserves. I think he could be a solid number 2, number 1 receiver for a lot of teams in the NFL. But when you have someone that's as dynamic as Addison and honestly the best receiver in the game right now in Justin Jefferson, you're not going to be able to get as many opportunities. But whoever the quarterback is out there for the Vikings on Sunday night does have 3 really solid guys to turn to.
Yeah, well, and when you look at this Viking season as up and down as it's been, as kind of crazy as it's been, it's really come down to the turnovers, Wes, and that's why Kevin O'Connell continues to try to figure out what to do at quarterback. He knows he has offensive weapons, even with T.J. Hawkinson being injured, as we've rattled off all these guys. O'Connell knows he has offensive weapons. He wants a quarterback that's going to protect the football and give his team the best chance and not put his defense in bad situations with the turnovers. Minnesota has turned the ball over 30 times this season, which is tied for the second highest total in the league. And here's how it breaks down. They're a 7-8 football team. That in itself is somewhat remarkable to have 30 turnovers and to still be in the playoff hunt here with 2 games to go. But they have turned the ball over 7 times in their 7 victories. They have turned the ball over 23 times in their 8 losses. We say it all the time, obviously, the turnover margin, the turnover differential is always going to play a big factor in this league. And when you look at it from the Packers side of things, Green Bay defensively has struggled to get takeaways. They haven't hit that stretch yet this year where they come in bunches, where you get on a run where suddenly, the ball is always finding your hands. Packers need that to happen on Sunday night at US Bank Stadium. They need something like that to go their way, because that's been the formula to beat Minnesota, is to get them to turn the ball over no matter who's playing quarterback.
Yeah, it was, as I said, it was the difference in that game against the Lions. Detroit does not win that football game without being +3 in the turnover margin in that contest. Here's what I find that's the most funny, though, Mike, because there's years where you and I have sat down here and we've talked about plus and minus with turnover differential and how that affects wins and losses. This year, it makes no sense at all. I mean, here are your bottom basically 9 teams in terms of turnover differential this season, starting with -6 at Carolina and Tennessee. The results are what they are. But then you have Philadelphia and Cleveland and New England at -7. Completely different seasons that they've been through.
Right.
The New York Jets, -8. Minnesota in the playoff hunt at -9. Washington, -10. And we've obviously seen how things have gone for the Commanders. But they're tied for last in the league with Kansas City at -10. And Kansas City currently sitting in a wild card positioning. None of these teams, I would, even now with the issues that Philly's had, I don't think you'd say, okay, they're in the Baltimore, Miami, San Francisco category right now. But there's good football teams in there that just have not been able to win that differential.
Yeah.
Green Bay is smack dab in the middle, right at 0 in terms of their net differential. They've actually done an exceptional job in the second half of the season protecting the football.
Yeah.
But again, as you outlined, trying to find ways to get the ball to take away. It's always going to be a point of emphasis in a football game that you need to be able to generate turnovers. But Michael, if there was ever a game where you're going to put down that exclamation point, it's this one, because it really probably is going to be the difference between a win and a loss.
Yeah, the Packers need the defensive effort that they brought to Detroit on Thanksgiving, where you were disrupting Jared Goff, you were getting, the strip sacks, and obviously the defense scored a touchdown in that game on Thanksgiving, and there's that's of immeasurable value in these types of games. Since then, we saw Keyshawn Nixon get the big interception of Patrick Mahomes in the fourth quarter in the victory over the Chiefs. But that was the Packers' only takeaway in that game. And yes, the Packers technically, statistically, they got 2 takeaways against the Giants, but those were literally giveaways by the Giants. The Packers didn't do anything to get the ball. One was the punt that hit the unsuspecting guy and created a live ball situation, and the Packers fell on it. The other one is Saquon Barkley just fumbling the ball completely on his own when he trips and goes to the ground. So those takeaways almost don't even count. I mean, I know they count statistically, but they don't really count. And then other than that, you had the early strip sack of Baker Mayfield against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which then ended up not having as big an impact on the game as you would want that one to. So the Packers have to take the football away in this game because that has been the bugaboo for Minnesota. And I mean, we'll be in the press box and at US Bank Stadium, it's an open-air press box, so we get a little bit more of the stadium atmosphere than when we're behind the glass. But what I was going to say is that when there are issues that impact a team throughout the course of a season, and it can be whatever, it can be missing field goals, it can be penalties. In this case for Minnesota, it's turnovers. As soon as Minnesota turns the ball over once, fumble or interception on Sunday night, and the Packers get the football, you're going to feel it in the stadium, in the attitude of the fans. Their shoulders are going to slump like, oh, here we go again. And there's going to be somewhat of, that feeling on the sideline for the Minnesota Vikings. The Packers can't let Minnesota just have one of these games where they get to protect the football because it'll play a huge factor on Sunday night. I want to talk a little bit about Minnesota's defense as well, because when we were discussing the first meeting between these teams this year, there was a lot of talk about, Brian Flores and the blitz-happy defense and everything, and, Minnesota's blitz percentages being at the top of the league. And then in that game at Lambeau Field, Flores hardly blitzed at all, relative to what their tendencies have been. I really don't know what to expect in that regard come Sunday night. Now, it's obviously, I always think it's easier to dial up the blitzes when you're playing at home, because you have that advantage of the opposing offense being on the silent count, and you can time things up a little bit better than when you're on the road and you don't have that advantage in terms of dialing up pressure looks. But that aside, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how Minnesota approaches things, because they just lost DJ Wanham, their number 2 sack leader on the team. They've lost him now to an injury. You have Danielle Hunter, who's got 15 and a half sacks this year with 2 games left to go. He's having a tremendous year. The Vikings have just been very unpredictable, I think, in that sense, in terms of how Flores is going to go about things week to week.
Well, one of the big reasons I don't know what Flores' operational philosophy was going to be in week 1, but sometimes I honestly think that all the injuries probably did affect how much they blitzed this season, because I don't want to say it's quantity over quality, but it is really jarring how much this team has blitzed over the course of the year in respect to where they rank in sacks. They're pretty much middle of the pack when it comes to sacks, but they generate pressure and they try to do it consistently. Now, what's interesting is you mentioned Wanham. They already lost Marcus Davenport earlier this season.
Right.
Davenport was seen as sort of the replacement for Za'Darius when Za'Darius leaves and goes to Cleveland. He was going to be the running partner with Hunter. I've been so freaking impressed by Danielle Hunter this year because, again, every time you hear neck injury, Mike, every time you hear fusion and that type of stuff, and knowing that he wasn't able to play through it for that amount of time, your mind always goes to bad places. We've seen it in Green Bay, how sometimes guys just don't get back from that. Hunter's done that, and he's actually gotten better. Now, I don't know if that's just his skill set meshing well with Flores' scheme or exactly what the philosophy's been there, but Danielle Hunter is a problem. And Green Bay's going to have to account for him in this matchup. But overall, just being able to kind of wear down Minnesota is going to be vital in this game. The Green Bay Packers offense that the Vikings are going to be seeing is vastly different than the one that they saw in Week 7. The quarterback's different. The offensive line is playing much differently. We saw this past Sunday for the first time since, I don't even know how long, Rasheed Walker took every snap at left tackle rather than that rotation.
Right.
And then obviously over at right guard, you've had almost a steady rotation now between John Runyon and Sean Rhyan at that spot. The Packers, I think you're seeing more continuity. I think you're seeing more consistency and obviously just more swagger amongst that receiving core. One of the better safety contingents that you're going to see in the National Football League with what the Vikings deploy and how they use those guys. But overall, I'm expecting a totally different game from week 7. I feel like these two teams, good, bad, or in between, are much different and much in terms of how they've laid out and where they're at in this part of the season.
Yeah, and handling Danielle Hunter, whether Flores decides to blitz or not, or blitz a lot or not, handling Danielle Hunter will be key here, because you look back at the last handful of games, Wes, and the guys that the top-notch pass rushers the Packers have gone up against, whether you're talking about an interior guy like Aaron Donald for the Rams, or T.J. Watt on the edge for the Steelers, or Aiden Hutchinson, Brian Burns last week. We didn't hear boo out of him for Carolina. The only edge guy, the only top-notch pass rusher who, in my opinion, had an outsized impact on a game over the last couple of months here against the Packers was Kayvon Thibodeau for the Giants. That's really the only guy the Packers didn't handle quite right. But otherwise, all of the top pass rushers from these opposing teams over the last 6 or 7 games, the Packers have done a really, really good job. Can they do that against Hunter as well? And then if they are, what does Flores dial up in terms of pressure looks to try to just get Hunter one-on-one, where the Packers can't, chip with a tight end and help out with a running back, because the running back has to have his eye on, somebody blitzing from somewhere else. All that kind of stuff. That's the X's and O's chess match that goes into this.
And it is funny now with where they're at right now with these injuries. Behind Hunter, in terms of active players, your leading sack artists, I guess you could say, for Minnesota are Harrison Smith with 3 and Harrison Phillips with 3. And Phillips is basically a run-stuffing nose tackle. And it's just kind of the way it's been for them so far.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned Chris Jones for the Chiefs as well. We didn't hear much out of him when another top-notch guy on the defensive front for the other team that the Packers handled well. So hopefully that continues. Well, we've touched obviously on the turnover issue already. What else do you see as a key to victory for Green Bay in this game?
Aaron Jones. I was doing some research with the story that I wrote on Thursday morning, and if you go back and you look at Aaron Jones and some of his best performances of his career, in addition to them just coming against the Minnesota Vikings, several of them actually come at US Bank Stadium. And last week, despite all the things that was working against Green Bay going into that game, Aaron Jones was the guy that got everything going offensively. He had 21 carries, 127 rushing yards. He looked like, I don't want to say the old Aaron Jones, but he looked like the healthy Aaron Jones again.
Yeah.
And it has been so long since we've seen that. And when you get that type of production, again, he has more rushing yards than any other team in the National Football League. And obviously they play the Vikings a lot. But if you look at his production against the Vikings compared to the Lions and the Bears, I mean, this guy's done a lot of damage against them over the years. We don't know what this is going to be like yet in terms of the skill position players for Green Bay. Luke Musgrave is back, but he's still on injured reserve with the designation to return from the lacerated kidney. Jaden Reed practicing again with the toe. But you have Dontavian Wicks now dealing with a chest injury in addition to his ankle injury, and Christian Watson is still working his way back from the hamstring. Mike, those are the top-of-the-line players for Green Bay.
Yeah.
Those are your studs, so to speak. And the fact that Aaron Jones was able to give Green Bay what he gave them, and the fact that he's starting to finally get healthy at the right time, I look at him as being the catalyst for what could potentially be a playoff push here. I think he's fresh, and the hamstring injuries behind him. As long as that knee's in a good spot and he can get his conditioning, his football, speed and everything back, I just think the sky's the limit for Aaron Jones right now. He's definitely motivated for sure.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say, too, I'll go back to what we talked about on our last show in reviewing the Carolina game, is whoever is at quarterback for the Vikings, the Packers can't let the guy develop this, boost of confidence that's going to suddenly, morph him from your average everyday quarterback into some kind of a Superman, because we've seen what that mental edge, what that edge of confidence can do for quarterbacks that have been struggling, and then they get things rolling, and then it's just too hard to flip the switch the other way. And obviously turnovers would play into that, but whether or not you get turnovers, you also just don't want that opposing quarterback to settle in and feel like he's in command of the game. That's where the Packers defense has lost control of things, is when the opposing quarterback is in command, not your defensive front, in terms of disrupting things.
It's a great point. And the other aspect I look at that is, conversely, take away Green Bay. I know Green Bay's been through a lot this season, obviously trying to work through some stuff right now defensively. But just keep this in mind, too. If you could generate a turnover early in this game, you have Kevin O'Connell on the bench with two other quarterbacks behind him, two other clipboards sitting there.
Right.
And now you start doing the mental math. And do we pick the right guy to be out there? Then you start thinking. Then you start questioning. I think that's another really important piece of this, is that if you get that pick, whoever starts, doesn't matter who it is, if you get a pick early, if you force a fumble early, if you generate in a takeaway and get points off of it, the questions immediately start for Minnesota. It's not just them. It's any team that would be in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you there. A little bit of sponsor business here, Wes. Sirius XM NFL Radio delivers hard-hitting analysis and up-to-the-minute NFL news that true football fanatics need 24/7, 365. And at Cousin Subs, we have something for everyone, like our Wisconsin cheese curds, mac and cheese, golden fries, and creamy shakes, all paired with your favorite sub or sub in a bowl. Cousin Subs, 50 years of better. All right, the playoff picture and the other games that Packers fans will be keeping an eye on Sunday leading up to the Sunday Night Football kickoff. I'll just rattle them off here, Wes, and I'll let you comment on what you want to. You have Atlanta is at Chicago. The Los Angeles Rams are at the New York Giants, who have now gone back to Tyrod Taylor at quarterback instead of Tommy DeVito. Pittsburgh sticking with Mason Rudolph after his big game at quarterback against the Bengals. Pittsburgh is at Seattle. And then New Orleans is at Tampa Bay. And not that one has – I can't figure out necessarily what's going on in the NFC South and how things would affect the Packers. But the bottom line is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers clinched the NFC South with a victory over the Saints this weekend. And if you're the Packers, that is exactly what you want, because you lost to the Buccaneers. You don't want to get involved in some kind of a tiebreaker with them in the wild card chase. So if the Buccaneers win the South and they're division champ and they get themselves the 4 seed or whatever the case might be, then that's a good thing. And then you're looking at the rest of the picture.
My big dad joke this week has been the Packers have been eliminated from winning the NFC South Championship. They are not eligible for it. So that being said, it comes down to this race to 9 wins. The Buccaneers already at 8 wins. If they win 8, if they win 10, as long as they win the NFC South, it is what it is. The thing you're more concerned about as a Packer fan is making sure that Atlanta and New Orleans don't get to 9.
Yeah.
And I look at the Bears game this week. Sure, I'm sure there's some momentum that could be extracted for Chicago if they would happen to beat Atlanta, but the Packers don't have that tiebreaker. The farther away that Atlanta is from the playoff conversation, the better for Green Bay. Simple as that. Seattle, Rams, that's where my eyes are.
Yeah.
And just seeing exactly how Green Bay is going to be able to shuffle through all that. Pittsburgh is a great matchup. It's going to be difficult going into that field and trying to get a victory, but Steelers are hungry. They're on the cusp of this thing too. You have Mike Tomlin trying to keep his record going of having whatever it is, 16 consecutive non-losing seasons.
Not having a losing season.
That there's a lot on the line there for them and a lot of pride that they're trying to get. And also a team, when we're talking about the turnover differential margin, currently tied for the league lead right now, I think at plus 10 on the season, which is kind of incredible considering some of the issues they've had at quarterback this year.
Yeah, that's true.
And then the Rams are the team that I think I am going to be most closely following, not only because Green Bay has the actual tiebreaker against them, but just because this is one of those teams that is peaking. And you can feel them peaking.
Yep.
If they come crashing down to earth a little bit against the Giants, that would be wonderful. But ultimately, even though it would be more of a nail biter seeing what could happen the last week of the season when they got to square off against the 49ers. And for that reason, if the Washington Commanders want to beat the 49ers and keep this thing close too and give the 49ers plenty to play for in Week 18, hey, who am I to argue with it? Let's go, Jacoby Brissett.
Yeah, there we go. That is the other thing to look at is if you're a Packers fan, you want the Philadelphia Eagles to keep pace with the San Francisco 49ers for that 1 seed, or even the Detroit Lions for that matter.
Yeah.
Because you want the Niners to not have the 1 seed wrapped up so that the Niners are still trying to clinch the 1 seed and that first round bye when they face the Rams in Week 18. Hopefully the Packers can get the win over the Vikings, and then we are looking at those scenarios. But I agree with you with regard to the Rams. You look at all these teams. You look at all these teams in the NFC wildcard picture, and I know I mentioned Seattle on our last show with them getting, back-to-back last-minute touchdown drives, to get 2 wins, to turn the tide of their season after they'd been on a rough losing streak there. But I would say of all of these teams in the wild card hunt, the Rams are the team that is surging the most.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about the Ravens at the end of our last show. Well, the Rams were in Baltimore and took those guys to overtime.
Yes.
As dominant as the Ravens have been lately, they almost lost to the Rams in their own yard because that's how tough the Rams are right now. So I agree with you. If somehow the Giants can bring the Rams back down to earth a little bit, that starts to kind of change the whole wild card picture as well, because I do think that team, Matthew Stafford's got that team playing pretty well, and Sean McVay knows all about playoff chases and how to make a run.
Healthy Stafford, healthy Puka, healthy Kupp, healthy Williams. It's been a problem for the National Football League.
Yeah.
And they are a team that can definitely get on a run. And as you're trying to kind of claw your way into this playoff picture, I think they're a team that you definitely have to keep into consideration.
Yeah, well, if you're a Packers fan, you are fans this weekend of the Bears, the Giants, the Steelers, and the Buccaneers, quite frankly. Those are the ones to keep an eye on, but probably more so than any, rooting for the Giants and the Steelers to hopefully give the Rams and the Seahawks respectively some trouble.
Yeah, and Detroit and Dallas is going to be a fun football game on top of that. There are some really interesting matchups. Obviously, the Miami-Baltimore matchup. For Week 17, for the time in which at one point there was a lot of okay, we'll see what happens here down the stretch. No, there's a lot of compelling action, and certainly it's going to help kind of weave together this final story as we get ready for the postseason.
I think what's interesting, that Saturday night matchup, Dallas against Detroit, have there ever been 2 teams throughout the course of one season who have been labeled for real and then a fraud, and then they're for real again and then they're a fraud again? Like the Lions and the Cowboys, the national narrative around those 2 teams has been rather humorous. When you follow it. It's just like everybody, you're supposed to get hot and Yeah, everybody wants to do that, but the league just doesn't work that way. The bottom line is those are two teams that are headed to the playoffs. They've both played fairly tough schedules when you look at how things have shaken out, and it's all going to come down to how they're playing in January and how healthy they are and all of those kinds of things. The fact that the Cowboys lost last week to the Miami Dolphins, that's not going to matter one bit with regard to the playoffs, aside from the seeding and stuff, of course.
Yeah.
But the fact that they lost that game is not going to matter one bit in terms of whether or not they're going to win a game in January with their season on the line. Sometimes we make a little bit too much of that.
It was funny how you said Detroit and Dallas. You kind of took what was going to be my punchline away from me there. Detroit and Dallas, you're absolutely right about that, by the way, in terms of the for real or fraud.
Yeah, when the Packers beat the Lions on Thanksgiving, everybody wanted to start writing off the Lions as a fraud. And you and I were both like, hey, that was a big win for the Packers, but, don't write off the Lions just yet. And look, they've straightened things out. They've gotten things going in the right direction again.
But it's funny with Detroit and Dallas where you're like, is there any other teams that have been like, I was going to say Miami's like, hold my clipboard.
Yeah, that's true.
They've kind of on the AFC been that team too.
Very much so.
But again, peaking at the right time. I will close the show with this because it was the one point I was going to make about the Rams-Giants game that I did not get a chance to make. Mason Crosby.
Yes.
The fact that he is now...
We forgot to bring him up earlier this week.
Well, yeah, we had a lot going on.
Yeah.
But Mason Crosby, the fact he's now kicking against his former team, the Los Angeles Rams.
the team he was with for 1 week. For 1 week. Did not play in the game, but...
But hey, Mason wants to go and hit a game-winning kick for the New York Giants after making a 52-yarder last week.
Wouldn't that be something if the Packers playoff picture somehow hinges on Sunday afternoon on Mason Crosby lining up to try to knock off the Los Angeles Rams? That would be fun to watch.
Rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated.
yeah, that's right. Congratulations to Mason Crosby getting back in the scoring column with those kicks he made for the Giants last week, and hopefully he makes some more. So with that, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of Packers Unscripted. Be sure to follow all of our coverage of the team and all of our coverage of Sunday night's big game from US Bank Stadium in Minneapolis. We will have it all for you on Packers.com. For Wes, I'm Mike. Thank you for tuning in, everybody. We will see you next time.